I come from a big family. I'm the second youngest of 5 kids, which I thought would mean more support and closeness. But as it turns out, sibling dynamics can get pretty complicated. My relationship with my older sister, whom I'll call Lena, has always been challenging. With a 5-year age gap between us, we were on different paths growing up, and it only added distance between us. Rather than a big sister who'd have my back, Lena always saw me as the annoying sibling who got in her way. And I'll admit, sometimes I probably did. Still, it hurt that she always seemed to view me more as an obstacle than a sister. Fast forward to this year, and I'm now 18, about to turn 19. Lena recently turned 24, and the big news was that her boyfriend, whom I'll call Ben, had proposed. Ben popped the question during a family outing to the beach in early June. He went all out, setting up a scene with big white letters and rose petals on the sand. It was elaborate and really beautiful. My parents were there, all the siblings were there, and Lena was over the moon when she saw the setup. She said yes immediately, and the day was filled with laughter, hugs, and a sense of celebration. Even our littlest sibling, who's only 4, could tell it was a special moment, though they were more focused on playing in the sand than on the engagement. But that's where the fairy tale ended. From the moment she slipped that ring on her finger, Lena seemed to change. She transformed into a full-on bridezilla, and I found myself getting dragged along for the ride. Since I'm her sister, Lena decided I'd be part of her bridal party, which meant I had a front row seat to the chaos that was about to unfold. It didn't take long for Lena's demands to start piling up, and they were, well, let's just say they were extreme. The demands begin. Lena's first rule was that each bridesmaid had to buy their own dress. She chose a particular shade of blush pink, which was nice enough, but the price was far from nice, a whopping $300 for a dress. On top of that, we were all expected to buy specific blush pink shoes to match, and we had to pay for our own hair and makeup on the wedding day. By the time I added it all up, I realized that being in Lena's wedding would cost me more than I'd ever imagined. But the dress was only the beginning. Lena wanted a bachelorette spa day, which sounded nice until she told us the cost, $800 per person. Then there was the bachelorette weekend she planned in Toronto. She wanted us to stay at the Fairmont Hotel, which would set each of us back at least $1,000 for just the hotel. And of course, we'd be paying for flights and all the other expenses on top of that. Even the dress fittings were a production. Lena scheduled several fittings, not just for our dresses but for her own, expecting all of us to tag along to support her. Each bridesmaid was expected to pay for their own alterations, which added up to about $300 more. The costs keep climbing. If all of that weren't enough, Lena's wedding planning continued to ramp up. She wanted each of us bridesmaids to attend every tasting session for the wedding cake, catering, and venue. Not only did we have to take time out of our schedules, but we also had to pay $25 each for the privilege of participating in the tastings. And then came one of the strangest things. She told every guest, including family and bridal party members, that they'd need to pay a $150 reservation fee to attend the wedding. It was baffling and felt a little surreal, but that was Lena's rule. To add to the absurdity, she expected gifts strictly from her registry or as cash, and she made it clear that any gift not aligned with her wishes would be returned. She even went as far as setting up a spreadsheet to track who gave what, making sure everyone met her requirements. Seeing the bigger picture. All of these demands and expectations left our family feeling frustrated and exhausted. My mom kept trying to excuse Lena's behavior, calling it bride anxiety, but I felt there was more to it. This wasn't just about wedding stress, it was about control. Lena has always needed to control every situation down to the last detail, and this wedding just amplified that trait to an overwhelming degree. She planned her wedding as a lavish winter celebration at a ski resort, which was beautiful in theory, but the sheer expense and the endless demands she placed on everyone were turning the entire experience into a nightmare. It didn't take long for me to realize that this wedding wasn't just a reflection of her love story, it was an extension of her need for control. I was just beginning to understand how her behavior, which I'd chalked up to sibling rivalry or personality differences, was rooted in something deeper. Now I was caught up in a situation that was spiraling out of control, and it felt like everyone around me was too caught up in the drama to see how absurd things were getting. I couldn't believe how far Lena was taking this, and honestly, I was just waiting to see what outrageous demand she'd come up with next. After Lena laid out her initial wedding demands, I thought things might settle down. Maybe she'd gotten all the big expectations out of her system, and the rest would go smoothly. But if anything, her plans became even more intense. It felt like every few days there was a new email, text, or group chat update with more requirements for her bridal party. Requirements that usually meant more money, more time, and more energy from all of us. One day, I got a message from Lena with the title, Beauty Standards for the Wedding. Inside was a long list detailing how each of us needed to follow a strict beauty regimen to be photo-ready by the wedding day. We'd all be going to hair and skincare appointments every 6 weeks. Appointments we had to pay for ourselves, of course. It didn't seem to matter that some of us were already juggling school, jobs, and other responsibilities. According to Lena, looking perfect for her day was now our priority too. Then there was her rule on tattoos. She had no problem showing off her own, but she told all the bridesmaids that any visible tattoos needed to be covered up. The bridesmaid dresses she chose were long and covered from neck to wrist, so that was mostly handled, but the double standard was clear. Lena would wear a sleeveless dress, proudly displaying her colorful tattoos, while the rest of us would look uniform, as she called it. Control over hair and body. Lena's demands didn't stop at clothing and makeup. She insisted that any bridesmaid with unnatural hair colors would have to dye their hair back to a natural shade, or, as she suggested, wear a wig. She'd even gone as far as giving color recommendations based on each of our skin tones, as though we were characters in a movie she was directing. I couldn't believe it. We weren't even allowed to have a say in our own hair. The restrictions around body size were just as frustrating. Lena picked out bridesmaid dresses that only went up to a size 10, despite the fact that not everyone in the bridal party fit that range. When I brought this up, since I'm a size 12 myself, she dismissed it as no big deal and suggested I lose weight. Then, as if it were helpful, she sent me a book about the keto diet. The message was clear. Looking a certain way was more important than how comfortable or happy any of us felt. My parents, especially my mom, brushed off Lena's behavior, calling her particular and saying she just wanted everything to be perfect. But I saw it for what it was. Lena trying to control everyone and everything around her. It was like she needed us all to conform to her vision, regardless of our own personalities or feelings. Handling her communication rules just when I thought I'd seen every bridezilla demand possible, Lena introduced her most exhausting rule yet. She decided that none of the vendors, the ones handling food, cake, or decorations, could speak directly to her or her fiancé, Ben. Instead, all communications would go through us, the bridesmaids, with a special email account she'd set up for the wedding. We were expected to keep up with every little detail, know exactly what she wanted without bothering her, and handle any issues that came up. The reality was that we had no idea what she wanted most of the time, so it was a recipe for disaster. Naturally, our mom was caught up in this mess too, getting roped into discussions about floral arrangements, centerpiece styles, and seating arrangements. It was overwhelming for everyone. Yet anytime I tried to bring up how stressful and unrealistic Lena's demands were, Mom would just sigh and say, "It's her special day. Just let her have this, the $150 guest deposit." The part that really crossed a line for me, though, was when Lena demanded that all guests, including our family members, pay a $150 deposit to reserve their spot at the wedding. If they didn't pay, they weren't allowed to come. She'd created a spreadsheet to keep track of everyone's payments, saying it was necessary to ensure everything went smoothly. Our extended family started murmuring about how unusual and unfair this was. My parents were a bit embarrassed, but they were so wrapped up in Lena's wedding fever that they let it slide. I couldn't believe my own parents were okay with their own children paying to attend their sister's wedding. Then came her requirements around gifts. Not only did she demand that gifts come exclusively from her registry or in cash, but she was also planning to return anything that didn't fit her specifications. In Lena's mind, her wedding wasn't just a celebration. It was a business deal, with strict conditions and rules for everyone involved. If anyone dared to stray from her vision, they could expect to be excluded. Seeing Lena in a new light, I realized then that Lena's wedding was a reflection of something deeper. This wasn't just about being a perfectionist, it was about control, entitlement, and a lack of empathy. She had always been the sister who expected the world to bend around her wishes. But with the wedding, it felt like her selfishness had reached a peak, and I started to see that she'd probably been like this all along. I'd just never noticed it so clearly. All of this made me feel even more isolated. I felt trapped between wanting to support my sister and feeling deeply uncomfortable with how she treated everyone around her. I didn't want to ruin her big day, but I also didn't want to spend months jumping through hoops for someone who didn't seem to care about me as a person. So I decided to keep a low profile, hoping that maybe, just maybe, Lena would come to her senses and realize how unreasonable she was being. But deep down I knew that this wasn't just a phase. This was who she'd always been. And as much as it hurt, I had to accept that my sister wasn't likely to change. The months ahead were going to be long and filled with more demands, but I knew one thing for sure. I'd learned who Lena truly was, and there was no going back from that. As Lena's wedding plans progressed, her demands kept getting more bizarre. Each new rule, each extravagant requirement, made it harder to ignore how deep her sense of entitlement ran. My family was bending over backward to meet her expectations, but she didn't show an ounce of gratitude. It was as if everyone's purpose was to serve her vision, and nothing less than perfection would be accepted. By this point, I'd adjusted to some of the financial burdens and ridiculous rules, but Lena's latest actions pushed me to my breaking point. Out of nowhere, she sent a group message announcing her final bridesmaid requirements, as if we hadn't already been through enough. This time it was all about appearances. The final straw, fitness demands. Lena declared that each bridesmaid needed to commit to a fitness routine to ensure we all looked cohesive and polished for her wedding photos. She attached a detailed workout and meal plan, saying it was essential that we represent her brand well on her big day. She even hinted that if we didn't comply, we could jeopardize the aesthetic of the event. It was absurd. Not only were we adults with our own lives, but we were also already dealing with work, school, and in some cases, families of our own. I couldn't believe Lena thought she had any right to dictate our personal routines. Her constant interference had gone from being demanding to outright invasive, and I realized that none of us were allowed any sense of individuality. At that moment, I saw Lena clearly for who she was, a person so consumed by control and entitlement that she'd lost any regard for her family's comfort or boundaries. She wanted perfection at all costs, even if it meant pushing away the people who loved her most. And for the first time, I wondered if being in her wedding was worth losing my own sense of self-respect. Setting boundaries with my parents. My frustration finally boiled over, and I decided to talk to my parents about everything. I knew my mom would be reluctant to see anything wrong with Lena's behavior, but I hoped that maybe my dad would recognize how unfair the whole situation was. When I sat them down, I poured my heart out, explaining how Lena's demands had become financially and emotionally overwhelming. I shared how exhausting it was trying to keep up with her whims, all while being made to feel inadequate for not meeting her impossible standards. My dad listened closely, nodding as I spoke, but my mom tried to defend Lena. "You know she's always been a bit particular," she said with a sigh. "And it's her wedding? Maybe just let her have this?" "That's just it, Mom," I replied, holding back tears. "She's not just being particular. She's using her wedding as an excuse to control every part of our lives. It's not fair, and I'm not sure I can keep going along with it. To my relief, my dad finally chimed in, agreeing that Lena had crossed a line. He admitted that he hadn't realized the extent of her demands and promised to talk to her. My mom, while hesitant, eventually conceded that Lena's expectations might be too much. Standing up to Lena a few days later, my dad invited Lena over for a conversation. I wasn't planning to be there, but he insisted, hoping it would help if I shared my feelings directly. I braced myself, knowing how these conversations usually went with Lena. As expected, Lena was defensive from the start. She brushed off my concerns, claiming that I was blowing things out of proportion, and accused me of not supporting her during the most important time of her life. And when I mentioned the fitness plan and the $150 guest deposit, She rolled her eyes, as if I were the one being unreasonable. You don't understand how stressful this is for me, she snapped. You think I'm just doing this for myself? I want everything to be perfect because that's what everyone expects. And yes, I expect my family to help make that happen. Lena, we're family, not employees, I replied, my voice steady but firm. I want to be there for you, but not at the cost of my dignity and self-respect. You can't just keep piling on demands and expect us to be okay with it. For the first time, Lena seemed to falter. She looked to my dad, but he stayed silent, his expression serious. After a tense silence, she let out a frustrated sigh. Fine, do whatever you want, but don't expect me to compromise my vision. This is my day. I could tell that was the closest I'd get to a concession from her. And though it wasn't much, it felt like a small victory, seeing Lena for who she truly was. The conversation left a bitter taste, but it was also strangely liberating. In a way, Lena's reaction confirmed what I'd been feeling all along. She wasn't interested in anyone else's happiness, only in creating an event that met her unrealistic standards. Family loyalty meant little to her unless it served her needs, and she had no intention of changing. As the weeks passed, I distanced myself from Lena's constant updates and reminders. I began to focus on my own plans and future, spending more time on things that made me feel grounded and centered. I even started looking into moving into my university residence earlier than planned, craving a break from the wedding chaos. For years, I'd put up with Lena's behavior, always trying to keep the peace and maintain the illusion of a close family. But now, I realized I couldn't keep sacrificing my well-being for someone who treated me like a background character in her life. I was done with being a passive participant in her drama. I was finally ready to stand up for myself, even if it meant redefining my relationship with her. And as hard as it was, I knew I'd made the right choice. Sometimes, the most difficult decisions are the ones that lead us toward freedom. After the confrontation with Lena, something shifted in me. I'd spent so many years caught up in her demands, always bending to her whims, but standing up for myself, even just that little bit, felt empowering. For the first time, I was able to see my family dynamics for what they were, and it was both liberating and painful. Lena wasn't going to change, and I realized that I needed to stop expecting her to. In the weeks leading up to the wedding, I kept my distance. I avoided the group chats, limited my involvement to only the most essential tasks, and focused on preparing for university. I decided to move into residence early, eager to start fresh and put some space between myself and all the wedding chaos. This decision felt like a breath of fresh air, and it reminded me that I had the power to shape my own life, independent of Lena's expectations. The final blow-up. About a week before the wedding, Lena called me, sounding irritated. "I don't feel like you're taking any of this seriously," she said, her voice sharp with accusation. "You're barely involved, and it's honestly embarrassing. You're my sister. I expected more from you." I took a deep breath, keeping my tone as calm as possible. "Lena, I want to be there for you, but your expectations have been overwhelming. I'm not just a character in your wedding story. I have my own life to manage. She scoffed, as if the concept of anyone else's life having importance baffled her. "This isn't just about you, though. This is my wedding, my one special day. I need everyone to be fully committed." At that point, I realized that no amount of explaining would make a difference. Lena had always seen her wedding as the pinnacle of her life, and she'd convinced herself that everyone around her needed to sacrifice their own needs to make it perfect. And in her mind, I was failing her simply because I was standing up for myself. I kept my voice steady, knowing I was making the right choice. "Lena, I'll be at the wedding, and I'll support you as your sister, but I'm not going to turn my life upside down for one day. I hope you can understand that." She hung up on me, and I sat there feeling a strange sense of peace. I had finally accepted that Lena's approval didn't define me. This was her path, and I was free to walk my own. The wedding day, and a clear realization. The wedding day finally arrived, and I showed up as promised, wearing the blush pink dress with my hair and makeup done. I played my part, but I kept to myself, avoiding the drama swirling around Lena's every command. I watched as she bossed around the vendors, barked orders at her bridesmaids, and even scolded our mother for a minor detail in the decorations. As I watched her, I felt a bittersweet clarity. This was who Lena was, a person who valued control above connection, who saw the people around her as means to an end rather than individuals. And painfully, I realized that I couldn't let her actions define my relationship with family, with life, or with myself anymore. I needed to set boundaries, not just for Lena, but for anyone who made me feel less than whole. The wedding went off without any major mishaps, but the emotional weight lingered. When the evening finally wound down, I slipped away quietly, not bothering to say goodbye to anyone. I was ready to move on from this chapter. Building a new future, in the days that followed, I felt more certain of my decision to distance myself. Moving into a university residence early gave me the space I needed to reflect, to process everything that had happened, and to start building a life on my own terms. The wedding chaos had been a painful wake-up call, but it was one I needed. I was done with being this supporting character in someone else's story. It was time to be the main character in my own life. I sought out therapy through my university's counseling services, determined to unpack the years of family tension I'd kept bottled up. With the guidance of a counselor, I began to understand that boundaries weren't selfish, they were necessary. And as I let go of the guilt that had come with setting those boundaries, I started to feel a deep, quiet relief. I also took the steps to gain financial independence from my parents, opening my own bank account and making sure I had control over my own finances. I realized that independence wasn't just about physical space. It was also about making sure I was fully responsible for my own well-being. This was my life, and I was taking charge of it. Moving forward with my own sense of peace. Over the months, my relationship with my parents began to shift as well. My dad in particular came to understand the impact Lena's behavior had on me. He made an effort to connect with me more, to support me in the ways I needed, and he even helped cover some of my university expenses to alleviate the pressure. It felt like he finally saw me as my own person, not just as Lena's younger sister. My mom was slower to accept the change, but she gradually began to respect the boundaries I'd set. As for Lena, she barely spoke to me after the wedding. She seemed to view my lack of complete submission as a betrayal, and she shut me out as a result. And though it hurt at first, I knew that it was for the best. I wasn't shutting her out to be cruel. I was simply making room for my own life, free from the constant drama and unreasonable expectations. In time, I found myself surrounded by people who valued me for who I was, not for what I could do for them. I made new friends, pursued my interests, and created a world for myself that felt fulfilling and authentic. I didn't need to bend to anyone's expectations anymore. I had my own goals, my own dreams, and a sense of freedom I'd never experienced before. Looking back, I don't regret a thing. Lena's wedding may have been the catalyst, but it was only one event in a lifetime of lessons. I had finally learned how to stand up for myself, how to set boundaries, and most importantly, how to live on my own terms. My family would always be my family, but I was no longer defined by anyone else's expectations. As I stepped into this new chapter, I carried with me the hard-earned wisdom that sometimes the best way to love others, and yourself, is to walk your own path, even if it means letting go.